Hey, what's up guys? This is Joe from Analog Archive back with another vinyl video. This time the focus is going to be on Blue Note, kind of the history of Blue Note, along with how the labels had changed from when it first started in 1939 all the way to kind of current day. So as I just said, Blue Note started in 1939 when Alfred Lyon and Max Margulis, however you pronounce it, kind of came together and decided to form a label that they called Blue Note, that kind of was derived from the notes that jazz and blues musicians would play at the time, a term that was used at the time. If you see me kind of looking down, it's just because I have a kind of a cheat sheet just so that I kind of get to all of the points. So early on for Blue Note, they focused on small group swing, so swing along with traditional jazz, so like Dixieland jazz, a lot of which you'd hear during World War II, while World War II was kind of going on. And right before the end of the war, Ike Quebec would end up actually recording some sessions for Blue Note that had a little bit different of a feel, a little bit different of a sound from what was kind of traditional of jazz music at the time. And it ended up being kind of a similar style to what would a little bit later on would people would hear, like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie. So in 1947, so a few years after they had formed the label, Thelonious Monk would end up recording his first session for Blue Note, and within a few years of that 1947 session, musicians like Miles Davis, Tad Dameron, Art Blakey, Fats Navarro, and Bud Powell would all record songs and albums for the Blue Note label. Along with that, in the late 40s, there was a bit of a change with the style of music. It was starting to get into more of what would be considered bebop kind of sound, a much different sound than what had been heard in the late 30s into the early 40s. So with that change, not only was there going to be a change in the sound of the music, but they were also starting in the early 50s to come up with a different way or different format for providing music to kind of the audience and to the to people. And with that change, so early on, the first about 12 years until so from 1939 to 1951, all of the Blue Note albums that were released would be on the 78 RPM shellac, so real heavy vinyl, but very fragile at the same time. So with that high speed that the record would be moving at, there was not a lot of music that could really be put on each side of the record. So with 1951 coming, the focus ended up changing to how can we find a way to provide more music on a slightly different kind of format. And they came up with the 10-inch record, which ended up becoming popular from 1951 until around the mid 50s. 1956 was when the 12-inch album would come out. And before the 12-inch album was able to come out, in 1953, Rudy Van Gelder would join the team of Blue Note. There was a mutual friend that introduced Rudy Van Gelder to Alfred Lyon, being the kind of still the head of Blue Note. And for people that maybe aren't familiar with jazz, Rudy Van Gelder is considered one of the best, if not the best, engineer really of all time. What he was able to do with the sessions was unbelievable. So with him joining the team in 1953, his kind of preciseness to the records, along with the fact that Blue Note was much different than other labels were at the time. They really took the time to kind of get to know the musicians that were going to record albums. They made sure that they were comfortable, made sure they had what they needed. Along with that, they also paid their musicians for practice sessions or kind of some rehearsals, and so just to make sure that the music sounded really good before they would actually cut the record. So with that, Miles Davis also had recorded some songs in the early to the mid 50s. They were all at that time the 10-inch records, so that newer style of music, which allowed for much more music. Instead of there being maybe 2 or 3 songs on an entire album, they could have 6 to 8 songs because it was spinning at a lower speed, which provided more room for the music to kind of take up. Jimmy Smith ended up being the first musician to record a album on this new format, this 12-inch record, in 1956. His album was part of what was considered the first kind of series of hard bop records, or kind of hard bop records that started in I believe it started in 1955 or 1956. His was not the first album that was part of that series, but his was the first one that was recorded that ended up going on that 12-inch record. So that's just a little bit of kind of history behind the Blue Note itself. Rudy Van Gelder ended up staying on at Blue Note for quite a period of time. He was very well kind of used by not only Blue Note, but Prestige and many other labels in the 50s and 60s. They really used his services because they knew how good of quality his recordings were going to be. But he stayed on from the 50s, 60s, 70s. Once the 70s started hitting, especially early to mid 70s, his production, the amount that he was kind of being the engineer for, started to kind of dwindle. And then once the 80s kind of hit, in terms of Blue Note recordings, it was very little. So just kind of start off, that first part was kind of about the history, and now we're going to get into the labels that kind of associated with the with Blue Note. So we're going to start with when the music started to kind of change to a style that was more what you could consider now to be a modern kind of day jazz. So we're talking about the early 50s. From 1951 to 1957, you had what was called, or what would have been on the record, would have been 767 Lexington Ave, New York City. Unfortunately, I don't have any records that are from that label, especially once the 1500 series started in 1955, 1956. Those albums are very difficult to find. There was not there was only 100 records that that kind of fit that series, and those records are very difficult to find, especially in kind of good condition. So unfortunately, I don't have anything to kind of show you for that label, but that was kind of the first label, the first kind of modern label that was associated with Blue Note. So once that 1500 series kind of started, them mostly being 10-inch records, and as you kind of, most of them being traditional 12-inch LPs. There were some, the early ones were still 10-inch records. So what we're going to find kind of, or what you're going to find throughout this kind of the rest of the video, is that there's kind of there was not always a strict pattern to this label fit this number of years. For the most part, it kind of fit that. So 1951 to 57 was Lexington Ave, the 767 Lexington Ave, New York City. But there are some, especially when you started getting into the later ones, 56 and 57, the label could potentially change to the next one. So the label that came after that, so once the Lexington Ave label was kind of changed, they moved to a different kind of headquarters. Their headquarters, which stayed on for quite a bit of time from the late 50s into the mid 60s, was 47 West 63rd Street, New York 23. So what I have, this one actually is from The 1500 series, this is a early 70s repress. It's a mono repress. But this is part of the 1500 series, Blowing Session, Johnny Griffin. A great album. Very difficult to find the original copy that came out in 1957, or 56 or 57, but the reissues are a little bit easier to find. So this this label would have been the 47 West 63rd Street, New York 23, and even the back of the record at the bottom, you do have that listed. So if you're interested in more for the complete catalog, at the time you were able to write to Blue Note at that address and get some more information on it. This does have a different label because, again, this was pressed in the 70s, but this one would have had that 47 West 63rd Street, New York 23 label. The next one is, so once we got past 1957, the label started to change. It was not for very long. This next label only lasted for about a year, maybe a year and a half at most. The album that I have that represents this New Soil, Jackie McLean, I've shown this one off in other videos. But this has the, just want to make sure it's Blue Note Records, 47 West 63rd Street, NYC. And what's very unique is that the one that comes after this, the only difference between that label is they add the word Inc. to it. So INC comes after the word Records and Blue Note Records. They also, what starts to happen too is the font that's used is quite a bit darker than what you see. It almost looks like on these labels there's it almost looks like it was written in pencil. So it's a very kind of fine tip kind of font that was used. So that's one. What came right after that, so when 1959 kind of rolled around, this one was 1959, but it was earlier in 1959. So at that time, what they did was, again, they didn't really change the label that much. The only difference being that you now have the word Inc. So now it's Blue Note Records Inc., 47 West 63rd Street, New York City. The only difference, again, is that Inc. part that comes after the records in Blue Note Records. It's also a darker font for that part. But aside from that, everything else is the same. They kept everything else 33 1/3, micro groove, long playing. All of that stayed the same. So very subtle differences. And a lot of times, like if you had found one of these records at a record store, and you weren't really maybe someone that had known a lot about the record, or even when I found that the New Soil, Jackie McLean, at my local record store in Rochester, New York, I wasn't even aware of the fact that the second press of that album actually had ink after Blue Note Records. So it's very fine, and if you're looking at it quick, you don't always realize that, but just the subtle differences can make a bit of a difference. So what came after that, and what kind of stood for quite a bit of time. So this took us, so the first one, just want to make sure they got the address right. 767 Lexington Ave was 1951 to 57. The 47 West 63rd New York 23 label was from 57 to, or sorry, just want to make sure, sorry. It was from 57 to 58, and then 58 into kind of part of 59 was that one, the New Soil one that I showed you, that just says Blue Note Records, and then 47 West 63rd NYC. And then what came after that, they added the word Inc. That was there for a few years, from 1959 through part of 1962. And then in 1962, they changed the label quite a bit. They got rid of the 47 West 63rd Street. And what they ended up going to was, so this, I haven't shown this one off. This is Green Street, Grant Green. This was actually the first jazz record that I had ever gotten. A really, really great guitar-based album. And if you do like guitar and you're trying to get into jazz, Grant Green is definitely a great start to that. So what ended up happening at that point in 1962 that lasted until 1966 when Blue Note was sold was, and this one's a little bit harder to see, but it's Blue Note Records Inc. and then it's New York, USA. And it actually spells out New York, and then USA is added as well. So they kind of just took off the beginning part, the 47 West 63rd, and they just stuck with the New York, USA label. So and that one is one that's popular. Again, that was for the kind of 62 to 66. And then in 1966, Blue Note was sold to Liberty, which was another record kind of one at the time. And actually, before we get to that, I have another one that actually has an interesting label. And this was, as I kind of alluded to earlier, the label is quite unique because this one actually has, on the A side, it has Blue Note Records Inc. 47 West 63rd NYC. But then on the B side, it has Blue Note Records Inc. New York, USA. So what most likely happened was they had leftover of the 47 West 63rd Street label, and then this one being pressed in 1963. This is a second mono press of this record. They put on the new label, being that New York, USA. So that was something that happened quite a bit, not only just at this time. This was kind of one of the more popular times that happens, and there are a few records that you can get that do have that label, but that did happen quite a bit, even from the 50s into the 60s. So that was just something that was kind of unique. You're used to seeing the same label on both sides, and in this case, there ends up being actually a different label that's associated with that. So, as I had said, in 66, Blue Note was sold to Liberty, Liberty Record Company, and the record that I have that kind of shows it off right now, Jackie McLean. This one came out in 1966. This is a second stereo press, but it still has the same label. This is a great Jackie McLean record, one of my favorites. Blue Note Records, so it doesn't have the ink anymore. It went back to that more later 50s into the early 60s, or actually, sorry, the 58 into 59 style that was there. But now it says a division of Liberty Records Inc. So that was popular. These are notorious for being, they still have a great sound. They still use the original stamps, the original kind of lacquer that was used on the original presses of these. But generally these can come a little bit cheaper, but you're still getting a great record for that. So the Liberty label was again shown from 66, and it lasted until 1972. Now in 1970, they decided to change the label again, and this one is kind of the most out there. This one is quite a bit different than what was kind of shown before, and really most of the 70s labels that were shown for Blue Note, when they did repress them, were much different than what you'd see with the original ones. So 1970, it was only really true for 1970 and then a little bit into 1971, but it really was just in 1970. They reissued some of the records that maybe had not been released in a while. So this is Lou Donaldson with 3 Sounds, and it's got, again, as I just said, has a quite a bit different of a label. It's this black and blue label. You see that it says Blue Note, which actually was what would be shown on the jackets as well a lot of times for the later 60s ones. So in like 67 or 68, they changed the way that the jackets looked for the Blue Notes. I wish I had one that I could show you, but it does still have that same kind of emblem on it. And then from there, they decided to reissue some in 1972, a little bit in 1973, but it was mostly 72. They re-released some titles, again, that had not been recorded in a while, and they were mostly mono, and they went back to that same label. So this is Davis Cup, Walter Davis Jr. Blue Note, a division of United Artists Records, Inc. So this is where the label changed again. So Liberty was kind of present from the from 66, and then in 1970, they were kind of what was actually popular for that one that I just showed you was it would say Liberty / UA, which stood for United Artists. So even in 1970, there was starting to be a change. United Artists had kind of gotten the rights and the lacquers for a lot of the label, or for the label for Blue Note. This one is just United Artists, and this kind of shows the change in ownership to it now being just United Artists. So at this point, what you would find is, and this is just my opinion, is that in around 1973, it was like 73 to 75 or 76, but you see a lot of them in like 73 or 74, is the label changed again. Again, this is still just United Artists. It's got a blue background with a black B, black lowercase b on it. These, in my opinion, have a really good sound. They also kind of showed the kind of the last of the ones that had the that used the original stamps, the original lacquers that Rudy Van Gelder had used. So this is Fuego, Donald Byrd. Again, these were popular in early to mid 70s. These usually can be found relatively cheap. The copy that I have sounds great. I got it for $25 compared to probably at least $200, $250, if not even more, for an original of this record. This sounds great. Now, I don't have an original to kind of compare it to. I bet the original sounds even better, but these are really great records. I've seen them, I've read stories about them just being kind of placeholders. There may be some, just like really all records, different albums maybe did sound better than others, but the ones that I've come across that are from that series definitely still have a great sound. And that kind of the end of United Artists. Now, there are a few that still have the RVG stamps, but for the most part, there's very few that do. These had kind of maybe a new stamp was created, or they had a different source of getting the music. Now, this one, it's very similar. The background is just a lighter blue, but it has a white B this time. So it's not real different. The background is darker, is lighter in this case, and then that B is white. This is Inner Urge, Joe Henderson. Again, this is another record that if you found an original of, it probably would be at least a few $100s, if not even more than that. This was $30, and it sounds great. So a lot of times, my kind of policy is if I can find an original, I'm obviously going to go for that as long as it's a reasonable price and it's in good condition. But if I find, like when I found this one, if I find a great reissue one that's from the 70s or so, these are always great. These sound great. And for me, the music is really the most important part. So after that, United Artists kind of didn't really do a whole lot for a number of years, and then in the early 80s, in 81, 82, Blue Note was sold again to EMI, which was a company in Europe. The first one that kind of got the rights once that had occurred was France, and the album that I have, the show, the label that goes with that, it was pressed by EMI Pathé Marconi. This was from 1983. This is Cool Struttin', Sonny Clark. Great record. This one's really clean. It sounds phenomenal. The French pressings can be hit or miss. There are some that sound great. There's others that don't sound as good. I only have a few. I have this one, and then I have Midnight Special, Jimmy Smith. Those are the only two I believe that I have that are French presses. Both of those sound great, and again, for the price, it definitely helps your wallet out much better than what an original would. This is a French press. The label is pretty similar, 33 1/3. This one's stereo. It's got the Blue Note Records, 47 West 63rd, NYC. That's not actually what the original label would have been when this came out in the late 50s. It would have been that the 47 West 63rd, New York. It may have been New York, USA, but it may have been New York 23. I can't remember which one it would have been. But this one, the way that you can tell that they're French presses, there is some kind of writing. Oops. There is some writing that's at the bottom. It's very difficult to read. But in there it tells you that it is EMI Pathé Marconi. But also you see this kind of square that's underneath what side you're on, and that kind of also gives it away that it is a French press, along with the fact that it does say underneath the catalog number, it says re-edition day, and then whatever year it was, in this case 1983. So the French had some the French company EMI Pathé Marconi did some pressings for a number of years, and then it got sold to Capitol. So while this was all going on, so once United Artists kind of sold it to the EMI label in Europe in the early 80s, the late 70s, it started in the mid 70s, but it's much easier to find these examples in the later 70s into the 80s and even into the early 90s, is the Japanese presses. And in my opinion, if you can't find a US press, depending on what your budget is and what you're looking for, the Japanese presses a lot of times are much cleaner. They sound phenomenal. And in some cases, it's your only chance of getting the original kind of format, whether it was mono, or especially if it was mono. That may be your only chance of finding a mono copy of that, aside from trying to find an original or an early copy. So with that, what the Japanese did, they did repress some, quite a few albums that it had been a few years since a repress had come out, but they also kind of took it upon themselves to press records that had not come out. So ones that had been recorded and then they were never released until they decided to repress it. So the first one is Tippin' the Scales, Jackie McLean. This one was recorded in the early 60s. I believe it was 61 or 62. And there were a few different, I talked about this. There were a few different companies in Japan that had recorded music or had pressed these. There's different kind of pressing plants. The first one was called Victor Musical Industries. I unfortunately don't have any examples of that company pressing them, but the second one I have a few. I'm only going to just show you two of them, and this one is one of my favorites. It was called the King Record Company, and again, just like the French ones, if you look below the information for what the songs were, who was on the album, in kind of small print, you can see what it says. It says Blue Note Records, a division of United Artists Music and Records Group, manufactured by King Record Company. This came out in 1979. This was pressed. So again, it still said United Artists, so United Artists still owned Blue Note. Again, it wasn't until 81, 82 that the rights for Blue Note were changed. The Japanese pressings, again, sound great, and a lot of times, in some cases, they can be a little bit easier to find, especially online, like on Discogs or something like that. The second one, Shades of Red, Freddie Red Quintet. This is a mono one. The other one was stereo. This came out in 1983, which was getting kind of towards the end of when King Record Company had manufactured or kind of had pressed a lot of these labels. It has the same kind of look to it. Again, you can see the information about where it was, the manufacturing being the King Record Company. It also has a lot of the Japanese presses below what side you're on, below the year that it may be potentially, if it's even there, was released. You'll see where it says JASRAC. I can't remember exactly what that stands for, but it had to do with kind of the record companies that were present in Japan. This is a great record. It sounds phenomenal. It's very clean, very free of surface noise, which is another thing that a lot of Japanese pressings have, is that they're usually going to be in great condition, not always, but they're usually going to be in pretty good condition. And the material, the vinyl that they used in Japan was much higher quality than other countries. And because of that, it was kind of free of noise. It was able to kind of reduce the noise that you'd hear in the playback. Once King Record Company had kind of, they changed hands, it went to Toshiba EMI. So after the French had the rights to the label, to the lacquers and everything like that, it passed then to Japan, and they had their own Toshiba EMI. The one that I have, Hank Mobley, kind of self-titled, is just Hank Mobley. This is a very sought-after album, very difficult to find an original, and if you do, it's either really beat up or you're going to be paying easily over $1,000 for a nice copy. So this, very similar labels, just like all the other ones, all the Japanese ones, they like to replicate the labels. Blue Note Records Inc., 47 West 63rd. In this case, this one's actually New York, USA, so sometimes that can change as well. It still has that JASRAC, and just like the other ones, the French and the other Japanese ones that I've shown you before, you can look below kind of the information for who was on the record, and you can see that it was Toshiba EMI. These pressings are still really good. They sound great, still free of surface noise for the most part. They weren't as great as King Record or the Victor musical that was in the 70s and into the early 80s, but they still are great Japanese releases. And again, they continued into the 90s. The labels didn't change that much. It still was Toshiba EMI. But while that was going on, so once we got into the mid to late 80s, the U.S. Acquired the rights again, and they Capitol Records was the one that kind of took it upon them. And what kind of happened at that point was they came out with a new style of pressing the records. Instead of it being like a lacquer was being created, they had what was called direct metal mastering, or DMM, which you can see on a lot of mid to late 80s records, especially jazz records. There's kind of mixed reviews on DMM. Some people really like that. It's a good alternative. Others, they say the sound quality isn't great. It's up to you. It's up. If you like the music, if you like the sound, then that's all that really matters. But there was quite a bit of a difference in the label, and this is what you would find really up until now, where kind of audiophile stuff has started to kind of come out again. You'll see for a lot of records in the late 80s, into the 90s, and even into the 2000s, there's a lot that say at the top, completely different label. It doesn't even say Blue Note Records, kind of like banner like they used to have. It now says the finest in jazz since 1939. This one was, this is Workout Hank Mobley. This was pressed EMI Manhattan, which was a kind of a division of Capitol Records. So this one sounds not too bad. The jackets are of decent quality. They are a little bit more flimsy than the previous Blue Note ones, especially in the 70s or even before that, 50s and 60s. This is a good kind of placeholder copy. I still have yet to find an earlier copy, but this is not too bad overall. It's not the best. It's a little bit kind of quiet, a little bit more dull in sound, but it's not too bad. I don't have any ones that say DMM on it, but that is one. Getting towards the end, the audiophile kind of pressings was kind of next when we got into the mid-90s. But along with that, the mid-90s into like the mid-2000s, there was a company that was called Scorpio, which was kind of part of, they're called just Scorpio Pressings. Rhino Entertainment, I believe, now owns Scorpio. They're known for replicating everything about the record to really down to a T, except for really sound quality. Most of the Scorpio pressings were digital to vinyl, so they were not an analog. They weren't using the tapes. The way that you can know it, in this case, it's on the back, on the bottom. It says 304 Park Avenue South, New York, and then the zip code. That's an indicator that it is a Scorpio pressing. As I said, most of them are digital to vinyl, so the sound is not always going to be the best. The one that I have, which is Cliff Jordan, this is part of the 1500 series, the 1582, as you can see. Everything about this makes it look like it's a vintage copy. This one does not say Park Avenue South, being that's kind of the indicator for that it's a Scorpio pressing. 33 1/3 microgroove long playing. I'm not even sure if this is mono or not, but they wrote that on. They put that on there. Blue Note Records, 47 West 63rd NYC. So it's got kind of the vintage labels, but unfortunately, it's not a vintage press. I didn't pay too much for this. I believe I paid. I got this at a record show about a month and a half ago. And I think I only paid like maybe $18 or so. And when I brought it home, I listened to it, and then I looked more into it and found that it was a Scorpio pressing. But this one may be kind of a diamond in the rough. This one actually sounds pretty good. So didn't end up working out too bad. And then the end, as I said, the audiophile pressings. I don't have anything that's early on. Classic Records was a popular label that was used in the mid-2000s into, I believe they pressed until maybe the early 2010s. This is Jackie's Bag, Jackie McLean. This came out in, I believe it was 2008 or 2009. This is a mono press. Classic Records, a lot of times they are going to be a little bit pricier. Could be $50, could be $100. Some really sought after records could even be $150 or $200. But they do sound amazing. They use the original master tapes. They did everything with, the jacket is real thick material. The records themselves, for the most part, aside from the earlier pressings, were like 180 gram, but this is actually a 200 gram. so it's much heavier than a classic record would be. But this sounds great, and for the price I paid, I think I paid $30 plus shipping when I had gotten this. This is great. It sounds phenomenal, and if you can find classic records pressings and you want something that sounds great, then this is definitely a great way to go. The last part is the Tone Poet series, which is a more recent series. I believe it started in 2000, might have started last year, 2019 or 2018. I can't think of the gentleman's name off the top of my head, but there were some engineers that kind of came together that wanted to not only repress some of the classic records that had been a while since they'd been repressed, but also in this case, Nigeria Grant Green. This record was one that was recorded in the early 60s, and it was kind of put on the shelf until 1980 when it came out in the US. Totally different record, or totally different cover to it, much different than what you'd see with a traditional Blue Note record. But this is one that just came out at the end of February. Great sound to it. It was analog to vinyl, so they had the original master tapes and they pressed it, and it sounds great. So I have Nigeria Grant Green, and then the other one that I have is Cornbread, Lee Morgan. This is the first Tone Poet series one that I had gotten. It sounds phenomenal as well. Again, it's the master tapes direct to vinyl. That's really the only time that I ever really buy new vinyl, is if I can be assured that it was from the original master tape, especially if it's a record that's being repressed. So that's that. So I hope that you enjoyed the video, learned maybe a little bit about Blue Note, the history of Blue Note, the long history, the amazing history that they've had, all the people that not only are the musicians, so the great jazz musicians that were part of the Blue Note label, but also the engineers and the people that worked at Blue Note. The amount of kind of down to the detail that was present at the company makes it stand out as one of the greatest record labels. So again, hope that you enjoyed the video. Tell me in the comments if there's something that you learned, something that you liked about this video. I'd love for you guys to subscribe. Thank you very much.